I've been fascinated with just like the centrist response. Because, you know, it was, to me, it made sense that if you're a right-wing conservative type person, you fucks with Jordan Peterson. But like, to be a centrist, to call yourself a person, you know, I don't have a lot of love for being a centrist, but obviously I'll take that over everybody to the right of centrism, right?
Yeah.
But it was so interesting to me to see how surprised many of them have been, and like the kind of cope, you know, like response. Like, they can't believe that he's doing this. It's like,
yeah,
you can't. What?
I think I've always been quite hostile to Jordan Peterson, because the notion that, like, from my experience, you know, 4 years in university, that it's run or overrun by Marxists is like, because in my experience, I had one Marxist professor, absolutely amazing guy, like I really loved him, but most of them very old liberal types. And as you can see with the disconnect between liberalism in the UK, it's also very transphobic liberalism. It's more like this conservative liberalism. And that was my experience for most people in university. And the Marxist Society, which I thought was a joke as well, and I say this in the Jordan Peterson video I just made, no one took them seriously. Like, no students took them seriously. It was really, really small. People just like troll them. And this is about, you know, 2015, 2016. And like the idea that like we're all being brainwashed into accepting transgender rights or, you know, socialism or anything like that, especially in the UK, where university is extremely like class focused in terms of like the institutions have always been designed for very wealthy people and powerful people, and the people who run these institutions are like the same people who go to like the top universities. I always find it like extremely laughable. So that's why I always never liked him, despite being more liberal when I was a bit younger, where I consider myself, you know, far leftist now and stuff. So I never liked him, and I'm happy I can watch videos back and be like, I never fell for him. And which is also important is that I was kind of into like, not the intellectual dark web, but the new atheism side, because I was raised Catholic, and I didn't have a bad upbringing, like, it was fairly progressive Catholic, but it always attracted me when I was younger to Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, the people who were pushing back against Christianity. I only switched when they started like basically racializing Islam, and I realized like
when they started showing their hand as well.
Yeah, they're all Western chauvinists. And then Jordan Peterson, that's why he fits nicely into that. Not because he's an atheist. He talks about atheism being the worst thing ever. Like, the Nazis did everything because they were atheists, according to Jordan Peterson. But he fits into like a very Western chauvinist worldview, which is very, in my opinion, compatible with fascism. And that's why so many far-right types, you know, love Jordan Peterson.
I wish I'd have had that term, Western chauvinist, which I think, because that's kind of how I pulled him into the manosphere space philosophically. Is like, obviously, you know, people keep saying Jordan Peterson and Gary Vee aren't in the manosphere. It's like, fucking obviously they're not, you know, Andrew Tate or whatever these other new, you know, shitheads are. Obviously Jordan Peterson and you know, Gary Vee and these other folks aren't red pilling people per se. They're not using red pill talking points, which, you know, would make them even more embarrassing from our perspective. But they do appeal to this, I like that term, Western chauvinism, where they're kind of like, they're here to steel man this, the standardized status quo principles of what appropriate masculinity is supposed to be. If you do these things, if you have these things, if you present these principles to the world, that is what is, you know, holding Western civilization back. That's what's keeping us in order, if you have it, etc.
I feel that.
But so I went to an HBCU, which in the States means historically black college university, which means these are colleges birthed from you know, black political traditions. Now there's still, you know, there's a lot of stuff there, a lot of liberalism, a lot of black excellence in there still. But overall, like, my school was founded by W.E.B. Du Bois. And by the way, everybody, it's Du Bois. I've said it every time. No shade to anybody. I've just heard it. I heard too many people say Du Bois, and a couple even try to correct me. It's Du Bois. So this is a school founded by Du Bois. I didn't have any Marxist professors. I didn't learn much about Marxism in undergrad. Then I went to grad school in sociology, and I definitely, you know, started to encounter socialist, you know, frames of seeing the world. But I wasn't radicalized. I still came out of I got through half of grad school still being pretty liberal. You know, I was probably, you know, brought further left by ContraPoints. You know what I'm saying? And the experience of like not voting for Bernie Sanders and being like, okay, I fucked up there maybe. And so like for him to come and say, and it's not even dog whistles, it's like dog alarms at this point. Well, no, not even at this point, like from jump. Yeah, it's been dog alarms. If you are not within that, you know, Western chauvinistic tradition, then you hear him say, you hear how he talks about immigration, you hear how he denigrates African American studies, like casually. You hear the crowd clap. You're like, oh, okay, okay, I see what's going on here.
Yeah. Also, I think you're referring to the clip I showed in the video.
Yes, yeah.
I said already, women's studies and all the ethnic studies and racial studies groups, man, those things have to go. And the faster they go, the better. They should have never been put. It would have been better had they never been part of the university to begin with, as far as I can tell.
But I've seen stuff like that from him before, but go ahead.
Yeah, but because I know, because watching your video on like the manosphere, the two-part stuff, you talked about the sociology and like Gramsci and everything like that. And it's very funny that everything he lists is basically something that is very associated with the Frankfurt School, like women's studies, like critical theory, critical race theory, all these things associated from the Frankfurt School. And then it's obviously going off in my head. This guy either is really anti-Semitic or he's just so naive that he thinks you can take a conspiracy theory that is fundamentally anti-Semitic and well, he's kind of
back up, because I feel like a lot of, because I had like heard this, but I didn't fully, I still don't fully understand it. But just assume I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. Give me like the Frankfurt School conspiracy theory like framework.
Okay, so to go back, because if I just say it, you would just think, oh, people just hate leftists. But we have to go back to like post-Bolshevik revolution, like Russia and Germany. So a lot of white Russians immigrated to Germany after they were overthrown, and they brought with them basically, we've been overthrown by the Jews, because a lot of Jews were more progressive in Russia because they'd been historically oppressed. Trotsky was Jewish, Karl Marx was ethnically Jewish, all this stuff. So they believed it was the Jewish conspiracy to take over the world, outlined in obviously the protocols of the Elders of Zion, that, you know, fake text about how the Jews are going to take over the world.
Good old, the classic stuff.
Yeah, and then that's became a big part of Nazi Germany propaganda. Judeo-Bolshevism, communism is a tool for the Jews to take over the world and fundamentally destroy Western civilization. And I read a speech by Goebbels, which, although he's blaming a lot of stuff on Jews, he talks about how the Jewish communists are undermining Western civilization, the Western tradition. And I was reading it thinking, this sounds, if you take the Jewish part out, this sounds like Jordan Peterson. And that's what I've always said. The only thing Jordan Peterson doesn't say is it's the Jews. He says it's the Marxists. But for a lot of Nazis, Marxist, Jew, not much of a difference. You're either a Marxist working for the Jew or you're a Jewish Marxist. And then in terms of the cultural Marxism, what changes is the Frankfurt School were a bunch of Marxist philosophers who fled Nazi Germany, came to America, and just continued their work. And like you outlined a lot of it in one of your videos, like sociology is a big one, critical theory, critical race theory, liberalization of like sex and stuff like that. And to a lot of Americans, it was quite, you know, part of that like cultural revolution in the 60s. Yeah. And the thing is, a lot of Americans didn't even realize, you know, they weren't directly influenced by the Frankfurt School going out and be like, oh, because this guy said this, I'm doing this. But it went very much in line with the ideas. And then about the 1990s, William Lind and I think like Jerry Fowler and some people involved in like the Heritage Foundation, they wrote this article about cultural Marxism, basically like a broad brush that the legacy of the Frankfurt School was Marxists are now infiltrating everywhere to undermine Western civilization. Then Anders Breivik, the mass shooter in Norway in 2011, he wrote it about like 600 times in the manifesto, talking about how cultural Marxism was importing Islam to destroy the West. And then Jordan Peterson essentially mainstreamed this, where loads of people now say it like it's not a big deal. Like it doesn't have a history of being insanely anti-Semitic. It's not very similar to Judeo-Bolshevism. The only difference Jordan Peterson is he's obviously like he blames the Marxists, but he seems to blend 1960s and 70s like postmodernism in with Marxism. And he doesn't accept that any Marxists have ever been critical of the Soviet Union. So you have like Sartre in the 60s, critical of the Soviet Union, still communist. Japanese Communist Party in the 80s, massively critical of the Soviet Union. He doesn't seem to understand that because, quite frankly, I don't think he's ever read anything about Marxism.
And I don't think he cares. I think he knows the thing that's been. So there's several things that have been popping in my head with this that I'm kind of percolating for, you know, future content is. It's very clear that being anti-woke is a really like easy framework for brand development and grifting money. Dave Chappelle is doing it right now. Somebody's been bringing the attention to me of some comic book guy. I don't know his name. It's a black comic book guy who's written for the Blaze. He's a libertarian, and he just got like 2.5 million for his comic book series. And so he had, as far as I can tell, he hadn't done much. And I'm looking at his YouTube channel, and it was like nothing. And then in the last month, as he became the champion for the anti-woke mob or whatever, you know, he's skyrocketed in profits. And Peterson, Kevin Samuels, who I've talked about, and I'm going to talk about in this future video, same thing. And then Peterson, who came to power, not power, but prominence, after his, you know, anti-trans sentiment comments years ago. Yeah. It's just very clear that as long as you are anti-woke, you don't have to even know, you don't have to have any useful like critique of the left or progressive movements or anything. As long as you are clearly against it and you can affirm my sense to be against it. But what makes Peterson so interesting is because, like you said, he was mainstream, which is to me the scariest and most upsetting thing about it, because it wasn't just, so there's many reasons why he was mainstream, but I think the key is just how irresponsible, you know, our news media apparatus is. Yeah. I don't like to explicitly color it as right-wing, you know, fascist apologia media, although it's fair to say some obviously is. But it's just that they're just chasing eyes, and they say, hey, here's this really controversial figure that sounds good when he talks, that will bring an audience, so let's bring him in here. And he gets up there and he does, and he's fucking, you know, Sargon of Akkad with a degree. And he's on NBC. You know what I'm saying? Or whatever the NBC equivalent is in the UK.
Everything.
And like, and so bringing it back to those centrists. So I don't usually, I engage with my comments, but I don't usually engage with like my response videos. But I saw one from a guy that I thought, well, so I was like, okay, this is the response I expected. But that was like, but then like, the day after I saw the video was when he had his Elliot Page freak out moment. And then like a week later, it was the video that he made, up yours, woke moralist. Like, it's like, okay, like, and I'm just curious. And so I came back, I'm like, what do you think of this? And he made a video where it was somewhat clear that he wasn't okay with the explicitly far right turn that Peterson was taking. But it did make me very curious as to like, what is the moderate Jordan Peterson fan before like the last month, right? Yeah. Like, what does that look like? You know, and I don't know. I know you don't have a perfect answer. Do I know any people
who are fans of him? Like, do you know any people who are fans of him?
Oh no.
I think I'm not friends with them. I know a few though, like people that might be like adjacent to your circle. I'd say so. Obviously, I could go off on one and be like, well, you know, centric, you know, what's it, scratch a liberal and a fascist bleeds or some shit like that. I'm not going to say that exactly. I think the thing with Peterson, it's quite complex. I actually brought up this cultural Marxism to a Peterson fan, just randomly saw this guy at the pub, didn't really want to talk to him, we just got into it. And he didn't know what I was talking about. Like, literally did not know what I was talking about. He didn't know he ever said any of this, because Peterson has, and I think it was interesting in the end of my video, it had a guy who was a fan saying he has multiple personas. And the guy that I was talking to had basically only listened to his self-help stuff, which is like shit and stuff, because he rejects systemic factors of anything, and it's all a personal responsibility thing, despite the fact he couldn't personally deal with his own addiction, like many people couldn't, and, you know, still giving this advice. But then people just take it from that, and then you have the American side a bit more, I think, where they take the politics of it and like, oh, debunks, you know, woke feminists and all this stuff. I think there's a I don't know how they can rationalize it, but I think a lot of people get into him for one reason and then stay for another reason. Or maybe they just get into him and they see certain parts of him that they like and they'll stick with him and they'll ignore the parts that they don't like, basically like cherry pick him. And because he's wrote so much and he's spoke so much, you can kind of do that if you want. I mean, like, you have to be like kind of bad person politically if you do that, not gonna lie. But at the same time, if you want, you can ignore some of it. And I think that's where the centrist Peterson fan before the Daily Wire, but then it's like, oh, he's joined the Daily Wire. Literally, he's just being paid for right-wing propaganda now. Like, I cannot ignore this anymore, because I could before I could take the philosophy, and now I can't, because he's literally just becoming a talking head like Ben Shapiro or anyone else who's.
So I'm in a weird space with this philosophical sociological movement called Black Male Studies. And its, I guess, biggest persona within it is this professor named Tommy Curry, who I think is actually in the UK now. And so like, I had never heard of this stuff before I started making content. I'm trained as a sociologist, in essentially, you know, gender studies, your typical gender studies with a lot of health and a focus on masculinity. And so I blended a lot of other stuff with the stuff I learned formally, and I've been doing black men shit almost from jump on the platform, to the point where there were a lot of people that were fans of him that brought his work to me, said, you'll love this because this is exactly what you're saying. So I'm like, okay, cool. And so here I am reading it, and I'm like, man, yeah. Oh man, this is great. This is great. And then I get to this section that is essentially academically based anti-feminism. And I'm like, okay, I don't quite get all this. Let me just do further research and let me talk, whatever. And like, I still don't get it. And then the further I've delved into it, I don't agree with this particular framing of the argument. And so I was fine with that. Like, I'm fine with a philosopher or you know, academic, you know, juggernaut type person who I can only get on board with to a certain level within their work. And I'm even okay with, you know, some like minor problematic elements. I won't be a fan of you, but I'm not gonna like disengage the usefulness of your contributions to a, you know, academic framework, right? But then I started seeing how this dude acts on Twitter. and then I started seeing the community around him, which is, you know, it's not, I'm not going to be completely fair in saying this. This is not completely fair to whatever Black Male Studies dudes are in the chat right now, but there's not enough of a gap between his fan base and Black incels. And it's like, there's just so much more to the work that I read that these dudes don't focus on. They're always focused on the anti-feminist takes, some of which are valid, right? There's valid critiques to make about intersectional feminism, especially as it's been co-opted in the last couple of years, especially with what happened with Black Lives Matter, which is a huge L for intersectional feminists in the public eye. Like, cool, but like, some of the stuff, I'm saving it for the video, but some of the stuff that's come out of that school of thought is, to me, like indefensible. And it'd be so easy for a lot of these dudes to just say, hey, y'all don't have to worship this public intellectual. You can take the things that he said that resonated with you and like keep them in your back pocket and read them when they make you feel good, and play it when you really need to clean your room. You know what I'm saying? But it's because, especially with the centrist, and I love that term, that Western chauvinistic tradition, people need to latch on to a strong male figure. That's something I've been fighting against on some levels, because I kind of don't want to be that, but I also know that's really necessary, especially on the right with Peterson fans and other figures. It's so, they have such a pull. So Peterson obviously has his biggest fan base is with young white men who are despondent for whatever reason. Maybe it's addiction, maybe it's, you know, mental illness, substance abuse, just feeling socially ostracized, etc. And what Peterson gives you is a powerful figure to superimpose yourself on. And so it stops being about what he says and about being what he is to you, which is why so many of them are bending over backwards who make sense of the word salad. Like, he's been doing word salad, but it's even salad recently. Can we, I guess, to pull people up to speed, because we've been talking about a lot of his nonsense. Can you help me go through like the last, I guess, a month? So he joined the Daily Wire, and then he had the weird tweet about the plus size model. And then he had the tweet with Elliot, what what's his name? Elliot. What's Elliot's last name?
Elliot Page.
Elliot Page.
But dead naming them. Just
dead naming Elliot Page.
Trying to get banned off Twitter, basically. Basically.
It seems to me like very clear, like I need to create an anti-woke, branding wave around my content so that I can, do whatever. And so what happened from there? Because there's the video about Elliot Page, then also the Muslim video, the Ukraine video, and there may be one more, but they're all equally insane. So like, take us from there.
Yeah. So I just want to start with kind of what you were saying. Peterson gave, and I think there's one thing that we don't talk about with Peterson so much is you say you've been watching a lot of politics YouTube for a long time. Do you remember like the anti-SJW like beginning, like when that became really popular?
Yeah,
and basically,
like the early days,
yeah, it sprang out of like new atheism, like new atheist content creators and so-called skeptics, and they went from debunking Christian reactionaries and sometimes like Muslim clerics and stuff to dunking on feminism and leftists. But I think combined with the right wing not having any credible like intellectuals and this online community looking for an actual credible person, like not just a content creator who might not have any qualifications. It's like a very established professor at university who comes out and they basically say the same thing as you, but it's framed in a very like intellectual framework, like why patriarchy like has to stay and all this stuff. Yeah. And then so like that's a sort of context of how he rose. But now I think like obviously he's had a lot of health problems, and I don't want to say that the health problems have caused him to be worse than he is, because I've always thought he's bad. That was the point of the video on Friday. I've always thought he's the same. But I think he's become a bit of an egomaniac, and the way he's been talking about these issues, it's just, you can come at it at so many different like levels to how he's so wrong. So the Ukraine one, I know I pissed some people off for what I said about it, but let's say his fan base turned on him for Ukraine because he's essentially saying Russia did it and it's the West's fault for being woke. Like that is the heart of his argument, right? Totally ridiculous. And you don't have to be left wing to agree with that. So I said, people get mad at me because I said, why would he invade Ukraine for being woke when they banned communism and they have a tolerance for
the tolerance for Nazis?
Yeah, and I was like, why would they? How is that a woke country at all? But then even if you don't agree with me saying that, you can say that like it's just a ridiculous justification when there's so many other reasons, like very complex reasons. Like I said in the video, Putin's own ideology on Ukraine,
right. Putin being basically a dictator at this point because he's been in what like 15 years?
I know, I think it's 2000 he got in. So 22 years. But then you have other stuff like historically, the breakup of the Soviet Union and, the West's influence in that area, including on Russia. And then for him to come out and try and put on a Western culture war in a place where no one would know what the fuck you were talking about if you even brought it up, it's just so ridiculous. But like, the thing is, I can't even believe that the people at the Daily Wire, like, understand that as much as they are kind of trying to back Russia, and because obviously Biden is siding with Ukraine and they just hate Biden. If it was Trump, I think they'd be okay with it.
Right.
I think they must know in some way he doesn't know what he's talking about. And even like you were saying with the Muslim video, it's like, are you going to simplify? Like, I think there is a tendency in the West to make Islamic sects like a monolith, like Shia and Sunni. They hate each other and kill each other all the time. It's not strictly true. There are countries where both of these, and Iraq at the moment has its sectarian problems, but there are places where these two groups coexist. So it's not like, I don't know, the heart of Belfast in 1990s Northern Ireland where like everyone hates each other. It's literally like there are countries where both these groups exist. You don't need to like. It's stupid because he frames it like
who the fuck is Jordan Peterson to solve a centuries-old fucking divine conflict? You know what I'm saying? Like, that goes to the Quran. That goes to the death of Muhammad. So we're talking like thousands of years, and Jordan Peterson's like, I have a message for Muslims.
It's the most bizarre thing as well, because because I've been reading, like, I've done a bit about Islam, but I've been reading a book about medieval history, and it really breaks down the split between them, and it's so like ideological and deep. It's like, oh, like the Shia think it should be like descendants of Ali and Muhammad should rule Islam. The Umayyad Caliphate believe it should be the tribal group that Muhammad was affiliated should rule Islam, and it's literally like they've been fighting over this. Even when they're at the height of their power, literally for 1,000 years, and then suddenly Jordan Peterson comes along, a white Canadian, oh, Shia,
a white Canadian Christian, Like, you guys should just get along, like we get along in Christianity.
But it's crazy. But like, let's go to Iraq and try that out. And it's like, oh, my family were killed by Saddam Hussein and the Sunni army, or oh, my family were killed by these recently legalized like Shia militias. It's like, become a pen pal with a Shia or Sunni and everything. It's just ridiculous. It's
for Peterson to make that video, the Ukraine video, and then of course the Elliot Page video, which was just like, to me, I think that was the one that hurt the most for the Jordan Peterson centrists, because it killed their narrative. So it was interesting. They broke down Peterson into 3 factors, kind of like how you said. It's the self-help stuff, the religious stuff, and the political stuff.
Yeah.
And like, I think you're right that some people will like one of the 3, maybe 2 of the 3, and stay away from the 3rd, whichever one that is. But Peterson is blending all of them more and more now, so that you kind of can't, like, you can't touch the self-help stuff lately without thinking about the political stuff, because they directly conflict with each other. And so as these centrists try to hold on to this like deification of Peterson, the Elliot Page nonsense was like a real, it was, I've heard some of them clearly say I'm kind of like distancing myself, and I saw that. I've been perusing that Reddit as well. There was a lot of cope and hate on the Reddit, because it's like, yo, it's clear this guy's just another right-wing windbag at this point, and it has been. And like, if we're honest, this is what the leftist has been saying for 4 or 5 years at this point.
Yeah.
And it's like, fuck, I guess we gotta, and who likes to lose to leftists? Nobody likes to lose to us. You know what I'm saying? Nobody likes to say that we're right. But when you have that video that he did, where he continues to dead name, where he acts like he doesn't understand what terms of services are on Twitter, where he clearly shows that he is against Elliot's transness, right?
Yeah.
It's not just, oh, I think you're whatever. He compares Elliot's transness being acceptable to going to hell in a handbasket or whatever the fuck he says. Some old, old causerie, dirty words from your racist Uncle Jordan. And so it's like, to me, that was just really surreal. And I couldn't imagine. I guess it's like, I don't know. It's not really like me and Kanye, but like, that's the only thing I can compare it to personally, is watching a person that you really identified with become explicitly ridiculous and unserious before your very eyes. Especially if you've been defending this particular thing about them for years now. Yeah. And he's like, nope, sorry, was a transphobe the whole time. Mask off. You know what I'm saying? Like,
well, because the way he used to rationalize it with that C-16 bill was basically, but I mean, it's always evident, because the C-16 bill was basically, you added transgender rights to the human rights bill in Canada. And I only found out today that in Ontario, where he's from, it literally been the law for like 5 years before he made his video. Yeah. So it's clear, like, he framed it in the language of totalitarian. Like, leftists are gonna put you in gulags if you don't say people's pronouns. That's essentially like what he was working with back in the day. And it sounded insane. Like, I will say, like, there could be a whole host of things. He seems like a guy who's insanely paranoid. He has Soviet art all over his walls in his home. He apparently talks about it. That seems absolutely bizarre to me, because he says he likes to remind himself that the Soviet Union could happen like again. And it's like,
but then he's supporting the Soviet Union as they literally unilaterally declaring war on a sovereign nation.
Well, I mean, like, it is weird. Like, now, like, it's like, okay, if you thought the Soviet Union was so terrible, I'm sure you could draw parallels between Soviet actions, I don't know, in certain countries and what they're doing in, like, what Russia are doing today in Ukraine. But apparently now it's okay. Like, I'm sure if I asked you, what do you think about the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, or like Hungary or Czechoslovakia, you condemn it. But when there's a bigger invasion in Ukraine done by a capitalist authoritarian Russia, then suddenly, oh, it's actually the West's fault now. But then that's what I mean, inconsistent, paranoid, and he's had really bad health problems. He was put into a for people who don't know, medically induced coma against all medical advice, which ironically he had to get done in Russia because they're the only country that would do it. And it's like, that was against everyone's like advice, medical advice. And he seems to have gotten, like I point out in my video, so much more I'd say, venomous and paranoid and just angry. And I think there was that element there always, but he was smart enough to know to appeal to, you know, more broadly, you got to come across as civil. Like, you can't come across as debunking someone with like facts, logic, and calmness, not angrily ranting in the video and acting like you don't understand anything. Because at the end of the day, you think, has this man lost some of his like critical thinking skills, or just lost some of his, I don't know, anything? Because he does, even I can admit, as someone who believes he has the same ideology as before, he does not seem like the same person. Like, and lots of his fans have been saying, like, he does not seem it. And you might have been tricked by the facade of calm centrist, but, you know, at the end of the day, I think that's what woken a lot of people up. It's like, you're so angry about this, and you're not even pretending it's about free speech or anything. You're just like, I inherently do not agree with people being transgender, and I don't want them to transition, is what he said recently to Carl Kalinske as well.
It's the most good faith you could possibly have to hear how Jordan Peterson has talked about trans people from jump, but also recently to say this is because he just doesn't want people to transition. The argument that a lot of TERFs and these, you know, these guys are doing is, well, if people, that there's children that are transitioning that are going to regret it when they get older, which I'm sure that's a thing that maybe exists in some cases. I've seen the cherry pick stories, but as a whole, it's very rare, as transness is in general. So to use that and to jump all the way to trans people should not exist, what is that but transphobic? What I've noticed is that the dog whistles and straight up dog alarms have been much more effective with trans and LGBTQ people, because the community's knowledge of like what that experience is and how it works and why they need to be protected is much less developed, especially like in you know, certain communities that I'm a part of. Like, I'll have to have conversations with peers who are who are educated, who are left leaning, and explain to them, no, no children cannot, you know, have gender confirmation surgery at a young age. No, that's not true. In fact, that's untrue for the vast majority of trans people. Do not have that surgery. You know what I'm saying? No, trans people have been going to their gender appropriate bathrooms for generations now. They didn't make that law. That's other people trying to make a law to stop something that was already happening that you literally did not care about until Dave Chappelle said something. But because it's so entrenched casually in our rhetoric and the way we deal with each other in our politics, it's such an easy strategy that is clearly very effective.
For sure. And I think, like you're saying, like you experienced this, like in terms of it's like a patriarchal system and this hyper-masculine like society we live in anyway, but then fascism capitalizes on that, where it's fascism has always been very, very masculine, and there isn't really a place for any gender identity or sexuality. Like Ernst Röhm, who was the leader of the Brown Shirts, was actually gay, and Hitler knew he was gay. Eventually he was killed, but he was gay, but in his head he visualized, I can be like the ancient Thebians, who are these gay warriors in ancient Greece. But fascism will always reject that. But that's why it's such an easy path sometimes from centrism in a patriarchal right-leaning society to fascism. And that's why a lot of the anti-transness leads people to ally with fascism. Like J.K. Rowling is talking about how great Matt Walsh's What is a Woman documentary is. And it's like, J.K. Rowling is known as a fairly liberal person, supports the Labour Party, hates Jeremy Corbyn, of course, but like supported the Labour Party, and then she's talking to far-right American conservatives, essentially someone who's described himself as a fascist before. That I love your documentary, which is designed to stir up hatred towards trans people, and specifically, it's and I don't know if this is true, but in my opinion, it's usually to men who transition to women rather than the other way around, because it's also seen as you are like gay or effeminate.
And like Rowling, Rowling and Matt Walsh is a great example. It's because like they meeting, you know, Rowling hasn't said shit about Rowling hasn't said shit about Roe v. Wade like a month in. Hasn't said a damn thing about Roe v. Wade, but still has multiple tweets about, you know, trans people. And so with all that in mind, to kind of bring it full circle before we wrap, and I know you can't answer this perfectly. This is like, I guess, my next like idea to play with that have turned into a video by the end of the year is these Jordan Peterson centrists, to me, what they really want, and I said this so much in the to an extent in the Manosphere video, because this is what I wanted when I was a liberal, is I wanted to think that the world as I had experienced it up until that point, in the handful of privileges I had, was still righteous in its existence. That people that came to say the world is really fucked up from my perspective, that I need something or someone to let me know, no, that person's just ridiculous. That person's perspective is skewed. That person's ideas are wrong and harmful. And really, they just want to destroy, you know, Western civilization because they're postmodern neo-Marxists. The thing that's interesting to see is the handful of centrists that are probably realizing it. You know, because here's the bottom line: you can come on. I know that's what y'all about to do, because that's what half the new atheists did. Yeah. You got to a point where you couldn't reconcile your internal morality with the bullshit that you were hearing, and then you watch the ContraPoints or Philosophy Tube. So don't come say, don't get too froggy in the comment section. You can maybe go to like other people's spaces that are more receptive to deprogramming you. Cool, but just, you know, I know you'll be here soon if you're not here already.
Well, it's
go ahead.
Well, it's like my favorite comment. It's kind of like related to Jordan Peterson, but if we're looking at the future of Jordan Peterson fans, my favorite comment about new atheism was, if you were an atheist when you were 20, you're either now a skull measurer or you're a communist. And it's like, that's the two paths outlined to you. Like, you either realize that new atheism is Western chauvinism, and despite rejecting the power of religion, it's not rejecting how religion has been able to influence us through mainly capitalism, but, you know, other mechanisms as well. And then, you know, if you're someone like me, and you feel like leftism and atheism is really compatible because you're challenging like capitalist power structures, which include organized religion, you become communist, Marxist, leftist. But if you're someone who's in it for, we are better than those backwards Muslims, don't let them come here, then you go the other way, and then you're like, oh, Jordan Peterson, he sounds right, actually, because he's talking about the Western tradition, and we shouldn't accept trans people, Muslims, or, you know, all these different things, or critical race theory. And it's like, with Jordan Peterson, I think the time, well, it hasn't come already, it's come now for these maybe younger fans, where, you know, I got into his self-help books, they really, really helped me, but now I realize most of the political shit he's saying is so damaging, I've got to like abandon him and move away from him. So hopefully over the last couple of years, a lot of that has happened. But then you got the other ones who are like, I actually liked all the anti-communism and like thinly veiled anti-Semitism about like the West and stuff.
Yeah, that was my favorite part.
I'm going to go on him with this journey in the Daily Wire, and just, you know, I'll be further radicalized because now I'm in, you know, the social media ecosystem of Ben Shapiro and the wildest thing about American conservatives. They don't criticize anything conservatives do. Like, they don't criticize anything the Republican Party do, essentially. So you are just going to become a fascist, basically. And then hopefully, but with Peterson, you were saying, that Elliot Page video and the comments, it's like, it's just not even pretending anymore. Like any pretense of this is about free speech and libertarianism is gone, because it's like literally like, I want the state to enforce, you know, that people cannot transition now, and that's it. So I'm hoping people wake up, and maybe I'm naive. Hopefully, maybe they'll come. I mean, at the side, but who knows?
It'll, you know, there's a handful of joys you can get in life. Like I'm that's why I like people. They want me to be more of a bulldog against certain people or certain ideologies, and I'm like, I really want to make this Nicki Minaj video, because you got to find joy where you can.
Yeah, sure.
And so that's what I'm telling people. Like you know, we'll fight to survive. You know, we'll make the sacrifices that may have to be made when that time comes. But in between time, you know, dunk on some Jordan Peterson fans this weekend. Like, it's you know,
it's
like
not like horrible shit. Like you got to do something for fun. Yeah.